Bienvenue à toutes et à tous pour
Welcome to everyone for this roundtable. In face of constraints, where should we install our solar panels? Which new lands should we acquire for those? And at the same time, there's a pressure on land that is growing, and the question becomes pressing, where should we install solar energy? And this is where we talk about new lands, dikes, canals, sides of the motorway, parking lots, cycling alleys. Those are new leads, and we're going to talk about those with our speakers throughout some feedback, including the one from the National Company of the Rhône, the CNR, on the potential of dikes and embankments. And we welcome Frédéric Stork, Director Energy Transition and Innovation. Welcome, Frédéric. CNR is at the same time in charge of the planning for the banks of the Rhône. Going to tell us about the Ophelia project on the cycling lane. So we're going to learn about these demonstrators with 100 meters of solar panels. We're going to talk about the potential of the roads. Sophie Guy-Motonia is with us. She's Director of Projects for Ecological Transition at CEREMA. CEREMA is working with the state to help collectivities on energy transition. You're going to tell us about the works that have been made with the road department and the mapping of the potential solar installation that you're going to be working on. With our next speaker, we're going to find out new experiments abroad. So we welcome Caroline Plaza, who's General Director for France for Becquerel Institute, an institute of research and studies specialized in photovoltaic. We're going to hear with you how the EPER law opens the road to new prospects along our infrastructures. And finally, we're going to discover a new way to practice solar energy with these new lands, with the experience of What Way. And we welcome now Arnaud de Sainte-Marie, who's Director of the Business Development for What Way, which develops a photovoltaic coating that is integrated now on the slab of the roads. So we're going to find out how this technology turns parking lots, cycling lanes in fields for solar energy in France and in the Netherlands and in Japan. Thank you to all of you for having accepted the invitation of EnerGaïa. We're delighted to have you with us. I'm turning to the audience. You know you can ask some questions. This is the novelty of this 2025 edition. You see the QR code on the screen. You can take a picture of the QR code, leads you to an app. And there you can ask your questions. Put down your first name. It would be great. Thank you. So now we're going to ask ourselves these three major questions for this roundtable. First of all, why should we go look for new lands for solar energy? Now we should wonder about what new spaces should we mobilize and how can we scale them up. So first, we're going to try to understand what brings us to get out of our comfort zone, roofing, or space on the ground. So with Caroline Plaza, why this research for new lands becoming a lever for the growth of solar energy? You say that easy lands have been always been mobilized, and you have this term which is called enlarged land space. If you look at numbers of the growth, there's 600 gigawatts that were installed in 2024. Now we've reached 2.3 terawatt crête in power installed. So we installed power, and we're going to keep doing that, solar power. So we have already addressed first the surfaces that are on the ground, that are close to the network, the grid, or the roof that accept the load and that were easy to reach. We do that for economic reasons. We have addressed first all these first spaces that are available. So it's a natural growth of solar energy to go out and reach lands that are further out. And with this growth of solar energy and this rate of penetration that evolves, We also see with the valorization of energy, and we need to go get more value and better be integrated in the energy systems. But we also must think about all the forms of electrification and have a bigger interaction with other usage. So if we want to install gigawatts, we're gonna need to find new spaces. And the research of new spaces, new areas, is about finding them, of course, and accepting them. So this approach to look for new lands is, you talked about agri-PV, we also it's also backing the interest that was around agri-PV, but also the shade houses on parking lots, and all this research of land and spaces, free spaces, or space that were already used. And this approach is part of this dynamic, which is true in France, but also elsewhere in Europe, in the world, to look for spaces along the infrastructure. We talk about roads, motorways, railroads, dikes, airports, ports, cycling lanes. Those pieces of land or areas are not used yet, and they constitute a reserve that is very important, with space that is already anthropized and space that is already consumed, and that may be ready to lift a few constraints of acceptability and work well with the other sectors. Thank you for this introduction. We're going to get in the depths of the subject. We're going to watch a few videos to really understand what this is all about. Frederick Stork, we're talking now about land, a linear piece of land. If we're talking about the works conducted by the Compagnie Nationale du Rhône, because you work on the dikes along the Rhône River, can we work on the topic without thinking about the users getting too tense? Isn't there a risk there? The risks are always there. But as you said, we're naturally looking at a linear space because it's a Rhone that goes from Switzerland to the Mediterranean. It's a very narrow piece of land, but it's sometimes it's a bit larger than others, where we can have some class traditional solar parks. But what Caroline Plaza explained, when we're looking at lands that are less easy to develop, and that's why we looked at, as of 2016, 2017, the way to develop solar panels on linear places. We thought about our dikes, first of all, because it's a piece of land that is man-made. Along the canals of the Rhone, people would go by there. Some people use the river who should be able to go on those banks to do maintenance work. It's open to public. It's not fenced. The cars are not allowed, but there's some people doing jogging or cycling. So we try to think about the best way to go about it, to have projects that would be energy efficient, and that would be the most accepted or acceptable possible. So we're studying in a few, making baby steps. As of 2018, we developed the first demonstrator on a dike over 300 meters long. Those are bifacial vertical panels at the height of man, and we first expect to have some degradation on the panels because they're reachable, but nothing happened. So sometimes they are on the roofs or in big parks, and people don't have access to them. So we took the bet, and the feedback was very good. There was no damage to the panels, and yet the fishermen go by it and respect it. And we can apply it in other demonstrators that we're going to do to prove, to show that we're listening to the needs of the locals and taking into account the constraints of all these communities. So you conducted a survey to identify the potential of those new pieces of land. It's not just about the dikes. It's a study that you've conducted with the Institute Becquerel. What does this study reveal? There's a huge potential, isn't there? Yes, we imagine it, but we had to go through doing the survey because we're on the side of the Rhone, and what we do in the Rhone River is a playground to show how it could grow and what are the risks, and we don't do this on our own. We have partners, and within the project Ophelia we had done a potential assessment at the French level that showed that we could have over 40 gigacrets per linear on all kinds of linear. It's roads, cycling lanes, dikes, canal, the size of the railways. So it's not just a raw land. It's all the piece of land that could receive solar panels because there's no shade. There's no effects of shade. Of course, it's also linked to all the other constraints that we have, PPRE, but it's huge because it shows that it could create 10%, it could amount to 10% of the French production if we were to do it all. So we're going to keep going to have your opinion on this new land with us. Arnaud from what way? We talked about the acceptability of that. And when we talk about those projects on the ground, and this question of acceptability lead us to work in a particular solution with what way, because you consider that it's a structuring pillar of this new piece of land. You talked about the easy ones to get. I think it's been used already. There's a number of constraints, and if I take an example on the roof can be saturated and not available to deploy some PV panels. We'll heard about constraints on the roofs as well that are not sized enough to receive those panels. The issue of acceptability is another point that is central for the plants, the farms that are on the ground or those that are on the roof. And to do that, we need to open new fields of solar power to produce solar energy and to know where to put it. And on that point, we have a reservoir of a piece of land that is quite big with surfaces that are already artificialized. They exist everywhere in the world. And at the end of the day, it's a change of paradigm because it's not about consuming new piece of land, but it's about valorizing what we have already to make it productive. And a number of countries understood that already today. Some countries that lack land. I'm thinking about Japan, where the state has passed a law recently to make sure that the land of transport infrastructure would produce energy. But beyond that, the private sector also took hold of the subject. I've heard about a supermarket chain, 7-Eleven, that after, in the years 2010, covered their roofs with PV panels for their own use. They got to the end of that, and now they're looking at new spaces, and now I think they're covering up the alleys of circulation in their own parking lots. So we see this is a logic that is everywhere, and in Europe we have also those pieces of land that we can mobilize easily as well. The goal of the European Union in terms of deployment of PV is huge. It's over 400 gigawatt this by 2030, and if you look at 1 hectare by megawatt credit for something on the ground, it's more than 400 hectares of PV panels to deploy in the European territory. In a France that is paying attention to its landscape, to its legacy, historical legacy, and biodiversity. I think it is necessary and urgent even to find land to deploy massively this photovoltaic. So it's not a marginal thing to diversify solar panels. I think it's actually fundamental for our trajectory. At Cerema, we consider that it's it's a it, you've identified some fields, and there's a whole field that is based on the road infrastructure. So you work with all the roads departments. How did you identify this potential of working on the roads, by the roads? To give you a bit of context, Serena is a public institute for urban planning, and we technically work with the state authorities and the collectivities in the implementation of public services, particularly in terms of energy transition. And it has been said by the other speakers, we must develop PV panels and renewable energies in general, but not at the detriment of natural spaces or agricultural spaces or biodiversity. So also it has to be done in a goal to reach energy sovereignty. So the idea is to work on those surfaces that are already artificialized. There are many of them. Some of them are part of the public space. And the challenge for us at Cerema is to help the public actors, the managers of roads, the road systems, is to identify those, to measure their potential with technical regulatory criteria, and to push them to valorize them. I have a concrete example that Olivier mentioned. It's about 3 years that we work with the interdepartmental direction of the roads. So those are the ones who manage all the roads, national road system in France, and they manage the road system that is still managed by the state. It's a network that has a very big potential, and the Ministry of Ecological Transition has mandated us to develop a method and operational tools so we can accelerate the development of photovoltaic on this network. So we focused on 2 types of lands: the rest areas to address the obligations generated by the law climate and resilience on parking areas, but also inside of the motorways, because they have spaces that are quite big and nobody wants to go there. So out of these 11 departments of road management, one decided to go on with those projects, and the TRA has come up with 3 places around the motorways and entering the city with 400 megawatt per hour that can be injected in the grid by 2028. And the laureate is going to exploit their plant for 33 years and pay a fee to the state to be able to use the space with the contract, a secure contract, with the constraints of safety exploitation, safety of the users of the road, and easy access to the plot of land. And this is all translated in a guide that has been made available to the users so they can identify what are the interesting piece of land and to put together a project and offer it to somebody who can use the electricity. So now we're going to hear about the feedback, and we're going to hear about projects on dikes, with canals, experiences in France and abroad. So before we do that, I suggest that we look at the first images on the potential of dikes, project carried by the Compagnie Nationale du Rhône. It's the Ophelia project, and then we'll talk about it.
Comment développer l'énergie solaire sans impacter les cultures, les forêts les espaces naturels et autres réserves de biodiversité. CNR étudie les parcs solaires linéaires qui pourraient s'implanter sur des surfaces artificialisées, telles que les digues, les canaux, les routes, les véloroutes et les voies ferrées. Collecter l'énergie photovoltaïque sur de longues distances en respectant les usages existants, en limitant les pertes électriques et l'impact environnemental, représente un véritable défi technique. Le projet Ophelia réunit 5 partenaires, CNR, Nexans, Schneider Electric, SNCF et Supergrid Institute. Pour relever ce défi technique, ils ont mis au point une architecture électrique novatrice permettant d'acheminer un maximum d'électricité avec un minimum de pertes, en remplaçant le courant alternatif par du courant continu en moyenne tension. Ces innovations sont testées sur un parc expérimental réalisé par CNR. Il est composé d'ombrières photovoltaïques disposées au-dessus de la voie cyclable Via Rona à Cadrousse. 800 mètres de linéaire sont équipés de 6 structures de 5 mètres de large et de 4,5 mètres de hauteur, supportant 1620 modules photovoltaïques, ce qui représente une puissance d'1 MW. 5 postes électriques permettent de collecter, élever la tension, acheminer et livrer l'électricité sur le réseau Enedis. Supergrid Institute a dimensionné l'installation électrique, fabriqué 3 transformateurs électroniques DC pour élever la tension de l'électricité photovoltaïque à 10 000 volts en courant continu. Nexans a conçu le système de câbles adapté au courant continu moyenne tension et le monitoring de son vieillissement. Schneider Electric a mis au point les organes de protection afin de couper le courant continu en toute sécurité au niveau de chaque poste électrique. Si ce démonstrateur prouve son efficacité, il ouvrira la voie à des parcs photovoltaïques sur des linéaires de plusieurs dizaines de kilomètres. Ces parcs pourraient être installés en ombrières sur des canaux et des véloroutes, le long des routes, sur des talus, le long des voies ferrées, avec un potentiel estimé à 40 gigawatts en France métropolitaine. De quoi contribuer significativement aux objectifs de déploiement des énergies renouvelables. Et bien sûr, les cyclistes bénéficient déjà des avantages de l'ombrière, avec, selon la météo, soit une ombrelle, soit un parapluie fort efficace. Ophelia est soutenu par l'État dans le cadre du plan France 2030, opéré par l'ADEME.
Voilà donc pour le projet.
So this is for the Ophelia project. It's very concrete. You can also ask your questions to Frederick on the project. This is not just images. It's a reality. Where are we at? Because we hear that the ambition is dozens and dozens of kilometers. Is it stage 10? Because before we get there, there are many other hurdles to solve. Yes, we'd like to be stage 2 out of 3. The first one was a linear park that we developed in 2018-2019 on 300 meters long to test the technology of bifacial. The panels are placed one next to the other. It's not on the roof, so it mobilizes very few land on the ground. It only holds on a part that is a meter large. So we're looking at a different setup because there are many bike lanes. So we chose to have a structure as high up because we need to do the coding as well. So the trucks have to be able to drive below. We limit ourselves at 1 kilometer. It's an innovation. It's so very expensive, but it's just an idea of what we could do the next stage, which is the third stage, over a few kilometers long, maybe 10 kilometers. Why do we do this in few stages? Because it's risky, it costs a lot of money, we have to go slowly. It's also the chance to test those linear projects. The first one, was mostly used by joggers and fishermen. Here, this one, it's more cyclists. So we work with the local communities and we ask the users, those who are going to live next to those installations. So something important has been said. We talked about continuous direct current. And when we build those, if we want to have similar power, we're going to have cables that are going to be the same. And when we talk about length of cables, we talking about loss of energy. The panels have to be held in a specific way, depending if it's on a dike or if it's along a road. So there's a cost that is higher. But if on top of it we lose energy by transporting it, it's a double loss. So we work with our partners to try to find the big advantage of direct currents is it generates less loss by kilometers. That's why we connected with the Great Britain in direct current. The idea is to find the right dimensioning of this technology so it could cost less by a scale economy so we can deploy this linear solar energy. So that's the whole challenge of the Ophelia project, beyond all the questions of acceptability, is to be able to find, technologically speaking, something that's efficient so the park costs as little as possible, as little as the parks that are on the ground. We still feel that we may need a subsidy mechanism a bit special, be a special tender dedicated to solar energy. It could be different categories. The parks from 1 to 2 kilometers would not need direct current, but beyond that, if we want to save, on the number of linkages to the grid, the direct current seems to be the way to go. So there's a technical challenge, an economical challenge. There's a real model to invent there. Yes, but the developers know it well. It's only the parameters that change. What will probably be more different is the quantity of support, because we may have to adapt case by case, whether we're on the side of a railroad, a railway, along a fence, on a dike. So there are going to be a lot of innovations to find. But this is not what is complicated. It's more the economic model, because we have a feeling that it's going to cost more, not twice more, but even if it's at the end of the day cost 10 or 20% more, it won't be cost efficient compared to the parks on the ground. So we're going to have to fine tune our economic model. So we're going to see that other foreign countries are working on it. That's the whole point to have you here, Caroline, with us, because you conducted a benchmark for the Institute Becquerel. So why does this benchmark tell us that? First one is that India is already a reality on canals.
Yes, it's very interesting what we can learn through these international benchmarks. There are all sorts of projects abroad, and in India you have them in parking lots and along irrigation channels, canals. So these projects are very mature, and we're talking about megawatts. You can't transpose the project just anywhere in a different country, of course. You have to take account of local specificities and landscapes. With irrigation canals, that reduces evaporation. It's being studied in the southern part of the U.S. So basically, we have all sorts of technologies. We're talking about slopes and roads. There's a whole range of places where you can develop projects. What you need to remember is that on the sides of autoroutes, for years, we have anti-noise walls in Germany and in Switzerland. There are auctions which are specific for the integration of anti-noise barriers, for example. Globally, these are constructed. They can be walls or something else, and they all play a part. So you have a whole host of projects. The roads, for example, congratulations on the demonstrator. In other countries, in India, there is a special project which we have seen. There's one in South Korea, and the project is between the lanes in an autoroute, and there are all sorts of models for building solar panels along roadsides or in the middle of roads. There are a lot of worthwhile projects recently. Frankfurt Airport in Germany talked about solar panels not in parking areas, but parts of the airport used by others. And they're testing vertical walls, like in the Sablon, in areas where the airport is located. These are projects which don't entail just a couple of 10,000 kilowatt hours peak. The projects are much bigger. And look at China now, on the autoroutes. There are different strategies in each country. We go on a stage-by-stage basis. Sometimes the farms are located alongside autoroutes or in parking areas, and the next step is slopes and tunnels in China. Subsidies are given. There are specific tariffs for slopes and tunnels on autoroutes in China. And in terms of figures, we're talking about projects worth several megawatts or several gigawatts. What's happening abroad is very interesting. The Netherlands have explored the potential of dikes. That's land, a big land mass. They also have certain constraints. One shouldn't forget the main function of dikes, which is to keep land safe from the sea, and they also have explored all these various possibilities in terms of land use. Along the railroad tracks, there are lots of different systems. You can include solar panels along the side of the railroads, the tracks. People are ever more keenly interested. In Europe, a lot of research is being done, and there are studies of potential alongside railroad tracks and autoroutes in Europe. We can talk about calculating the potential and this and that, but we're talking about 400 gigawatts peak power. There are ministries who have conducted the research. In all these areas, it's not just in France and in Europe that people are keenly interested, but across the world. It's a real strategic issue, as we have seen in the introduction. We had the European conference on technology, and people were talking about PV everywhere. So great progress is being made when it comes to including PV. It's very versatile. There's a wide range of solutions when it comes to photovoltaics. Thank you very much for this very complete overview. In the last part, what are the conditions? What have you concluded in terms of acceptability, conflicts of usage? But we'll actually address those issues right at the end. Now let's continue to discover technologies and experiments. Let's look at a different way of producing solar energy and using spaces. We'll talk with Arnaud de Sainte-Marie from Wattway. We'll see the images which depict the Wattway solutions.
Voilà, avec les images, c'est aussi beaucoup plus parlant. On comprend mieux ce
These
que fait
images are
Wattway. On voit
very
que c'est un
eloquent. We can see what
revêtement
Wattway is
solaire
doing.
circulable.
It's solar panels on which you can cycle. Yes, absolutely. The purpose is to use these surfaces, which are already artificial. The idea is for them to produce renewable energy. A few words about the way things work. The technological choice we made was to have panels that are very thin, 5 millimeters thick. These panels are composite, they're not made of glass. We have the photovoltaic cells, which are very traditional in them. We have these thin panels because basically there's no major civil engineering work that's necessary. We just apply them as an additional layer on the paved over areas that already exist.
Je dirais que tout ça, nous le faisons dans un esprit
And we do this as a kind of retrofitting of these artificial areas, these paved areas.
Un passage de toute la partie électrique, toute l'architecture électrique en
You
souterrain.
have the electrical architecture, which is underground, it's watertight, and the architecture is similar to traditional PVs.
Une armoire électrique, des onduleurs, etc.
You have ondulators, etc., etc.
Nous avons, après une période de R&D, nous avons développé cette
After
technologie.
R&D, we developed, or we tested this technology
Avec une cinquantaine de sites.
in about 50 sites in 10 countries around the world. We wanted to test different climates and different types of traffic.
Que nous adressons avec ces modules.
And then with these modules, we set up units where we can master the traffic, parking areas, sidewalks, cycle paths, as you saw, airport areas, train stations, and so on. We have quite a lot of feedback based on 150 sites in about 10 countries. What stands out is the discussions we held with the Netherlands. The state is pushing for energy transition. It doesn't want to take farming land away, and so they really try to have pooled use of paved over areas. They focused on cycle tracks. There are 35,000 kilometers of cycle track, which is a lot, and the state has asked the Dutch provinces to create a certain number of calls for tender to use this kind of technology. We won 2 bids, and we have a 280 kilowatt peak project. This kind of land, therefore, is very relevant when it comes to producing photovoltaic energy. The other thing I can talk about is Japan. Before we talk about Japan, on the cycle path in the Netherlands, how many meters or hundreds of meters or kilometers do you have of PVs? It's about 2 kilometers, which were equipped with these modules. You didn't go beyond that? There are no special technical problems? We're talking about high voltage. It's what Frédéric Stock was saying. Did you encounter similar difficulties? Yes. We're keenly interested in what the CNR is doing. We often are in contact. It's a very key question. When you've got this long line of PVs, you want to ramp up the voltage. So we are a designer and a manufacturer of these modules. We then install them, and we're prepared to integrate new technologies, particularly when it comes to the electric architecture. Let's look at the example of Japan, which is a very interesting one. The model is different. There is a dearth of free land in Japan, so the idea is pooled use of land. We are in contact with the Tokyo City and the government. The idea is to roll out plants in service areas next to autoroutes. These sites, we're talking about 300 kilos.
d'avoir de l'énergie.
The idea is to have energy whatever, despite the violent weather conditions which sometimes prevail in Japan. So it's a very interesting experiment. We have feedback from areas in France and in Europe concerning parking areas, cycle paths, the approach to stations and so on. When you're in a built-up area, it's sometimes nice to have a very discrete module and system, and that's why we have created the kind of technology we have on offer. Things have to be compatible with historic buildings too. Our technology has been validated by the Architecte des Bâtiments de France, and that's a really important point. So you're talking about the area in front of churches, very old churches, for example. One of our customers pointed out that what way makes it possible to create land for solar energy where such land wasn't available. Hence the whole point of the technology we're proposing. You saw the video. It was a pleasure craft harbor near Marseille. And there's very little space. We didn't have much space on the roof of the harbor master's house. So the idea was to use the wharves in the port. These areas are very touristy, and so the modules have to be very discrete. Now I'd like to talk about airports. Airports knocked on our door. They have a lot of space on the parking side, but once the land is being used, they then have on the runway side quite a lot of space available. They're interested in our technologies because you have a whole network of service routes for monitoring, safety, security, and there's a lot of mileage there which can be used for renewable energy. What about light, reflection of the sun? We have to abide by various regulatory phases, but what we've realized, and I think this topic will have been dealt with by the first quarter of next year, indeed, after the first project, there'll probably be a snowball effect because it's very important to find land for all these structures. I'd like to ask Sophie from CEREMA to talk about what you've learned from your work on the roads. We'll take a question. Solar panels, do they require special maintenance in the cases that we have seen? And what happens when they're partially obstructed? Have you worked on these issues, Frédéric? Yes. In specific cases, when you have vertical panels, like along a dike, they don't get very dirty, because that's a problem for all the solar panel farms. It's not a major issue, because whatever the setup, we can find solutions, like for the conventional ground-based panels. For vertical panels, they don't tend to get that dirty. That's a plus. However, they're more exposed to wind, so you have the problem of sizing, which has to be carefully worked out. These are conventional modules, however. Two-faced panels, which catch the sun on both sides, cost about as much as the standard module. They're more watertight, and in Ophelia, we're talking about using both sides of the panel, as they're quite high up. We have a gain of energy thanks to reflection off the ground. So on a cycle path, there's a bit of gravel, a bit of grass, and there's quite a lot of reflection, which produces additional energy for about the same cost as a standard solar panel. Yes.
pouvez avoir un encrassement, mais qui reste superficiel, notamment dans
The panels may get dirty the first month, but it's usually quite superficial. Why? Because our modules have a slightly granular coating.
de surface.
It's a surface resin which is anti-skid. So sometimes it picks up a bit of dust, but basically we take this into account in the sizing of the panels, and we realize that then things become stable thanks to rain and vehicles. There's a kind of self-cleaning mechanism. The impact is very limited, therefore. We checked on this in a certain number of parking lots. The traditional surface area is cleaned by normal cleaning devices with brushes, and they clean our modules, and there's no real difference. So we can now say that we really don't need to take any specific precautions. Thank you. Sophie, what have you learned from your work with on roads? We have learned a very great deal. The world of roads and the world of energy are very different. First of all, we realized that we had to explain things a lot to people. Highway management companies knew nothing about PV projects. Their job is safety and maintaining the roads. It was therefore necessary to reassure them and teach them quite a lot, give them the right keys so that they can manage all these projects independently. The second thing we learned pertains to land. Where are the most interesting sites located? When we began, there was no consolidated data about the national road network. We had to start from scratch, and we now geolocate all the relevant sites with the right characteristics. This is now public, and it's available on the ONR site. The third thing we learned pertains to the financial engineering and legal engineering. That's indispensable to move from just a project to a real site. We work with the Ministry of the Economy, which produced an economic and legal model which is suited to those who manage roads. This provides for attractiveness, reassures the operators as to security and safety. So it takes a certain amount of time. You need to support people. You need a lot of data on the land, so you know what's the right place to set up these projects. And the financial engineering is indispensable prior to actually implementing the projects. Have you identified certain limits as well? Yes. Limits. We talked about a lot of different kinds of land in the course of this roundtable. Some land is more mature than others. The constraints are bigger. Some constraints are greater. For example, exits and entrances to autoroutes. There's no environmental problem, no competition in terms of usage, so the local acceptability is eased, and the surface area is quite big, several hectares in some cases, but there are constraints. One can control the constraints. You have to ensure that road safety is guaranteed. There must be the right visibility for drivers. There's the issue of accessibility to the plot of land. Once we've managed all this and everything is safe, then we can control all the other parameters. There are some more innovative projects too, like covering roads. We're working with Marseille, Nantes, and Lyon. There, the constraints are on a different scale. We're talking about the road itself and not approaches to the road. So you have to be able to clean the panels, for example. Road safety is important. You create lateral obstacles on the side of the road, so you have to protect the area to avoid accidents. What happens if there is an accident with the structure? What's the impact of the structure? How you limit this? What about quality of air, rainwater, biodiversity impacts? What about the energy output? This is linear, so there will be a loss of energy, perhaps, and what do you do with the energy produced? So the limits are numerous. There are certain sites where we can control them. Elsewhere, it takes more time to lift the legal, regulatory, and other obstacles. But I think we can achieve all this. We're talking about all these conditions. Caroline, what are these conditions in terms of the challenge of PV? What are the real challenges when venturing into these new areas? We have the PER law. What does that enable? I have quite a lot to say on these topics. I share the view of Sophie and Frédéric. We're talking about all different types of land, and there's a diversity in the systems. We're talking there's slopes, there are roads, there are vertical structures, dual-facing panels. Depending on the case, the solution will be different. Obviously, we have to realize that you can't just do a cut-and-paste job with these new forms of usage. We shouldn't forget that we're dealing with land that has an initial use already. It has a first function already. For example, on roads, road safety, visibility, accessibility, emergency services. If there are posts, that could be an issue. Accessibility for emergency services, that's important. Likewise, railroad safety. There are a lot of constraints in that world, too. So there are a lot of regulatory constraints in the areas where we want to add these new solar panels, and we have to factor in all the standards and safety features. In other words, we are encroaching on areas and systems which already have their own standards, be it roads or railroads, tracks, airports. There are lots and lots of constraints, so we have to adapt each time. You have to look at each location and the impact and the constraints imposed by the main function or the first function of the land. That's the first thing. And as you said, we then have to look at the business model. Sometimes we're talking about land that belongs to the state. Sometimes it's land with a different status. How is this land going to be made available? We have to work with all the stakeholders. How long will these facilities remain in operation? We have to solve all these issues because the land is subject to different forms of ownership, shared between the state and private hands, for example. Then what about the electric architecture? When we have long straight lines, we have the connection issue. We have to ramp up the voltage. A lot of work has to be done with a direct current. In Switzerland, we shared a lot of experience, and I said in Switzerland, well, you have very long lengths of solar panels, and they said, well, we have the consumption, we have an anti-noise wall, and this long line is not just an electricity line. They cut the project into several different connection points, so the architecture was no longer linear. So you have to look at other usages too. Maybe if you're near to a service station, near a road, perhaps there are different stages when it comes to the actual connection. With railroads, And the railroads can use some of the energy produced. The usage, therefore, and the actual system have to be tailor-made. And I'm referring here to all these challenges. In these areas, there's already a prime use, which creates a constraint for the solar panels. The solar panels are a constraint as well because of the geometry, as you said, and because of the use. If I'm next to a railroad, will there be stones that are projected onto the solar panels, gravel? You have to look at all these issues. You therefore have to look at the prime function. Is it going to have an impact on production, and if so, what? So you have quite a lot of issues to look at: the business model, the technical side, electricity, architecture, usage. And I don't think I mentioned the law that we were talking about earlier on. Yes, you're quite right. Okay. Will this law enable us to use these new land areas? Yes, I think it sends out a positive, strong positive signal. The appel law, for example, modifies the ability to build next to autoroutes. You can add the production of energy, for example. And likewise, it changes the code that prevails in railroad transport. These changes are adjustments, but they show a strong will. The regulations have been changed in view of PV, and likewise in areas where you have boating in France, as of the appel law, it became clear that the potential in terms of renewable energy has been taken into account. There are any number of issues we can address, but now because we have this idea of linear structures and using the areas all along these linear structures, that's been incorporated in the law. Thank you very much. You've talked about any number of challenges, including the many kilometers. You've talked about these new structures, the many kilometers that are now going to be developed. Yes, indeed. We've plunged into this area. It's what's more complicated is very lengthy lines. The idea is to equip specific things like cycle paths. Well, we can use short lengths, but the length of a river, that's very tempting. There's several hundred kilometers along the Rhone River. You have canals which can be covered. The additional difficulty is that you have the electricity architecture to make these farms as efficient as possible and waste as little energy as possible. We have high hopes that we'll achieve all this. We're working with Schneider and the SNCF and many other entities. The demonstrator is up and running, and we'll move on to a 3-year period of real testing. The goal is to define the right sizing of these projects so they're as versatile as possible. What I didn't mention yet, but Caroline touched upon it, is that the advantage of equipping these long lines of land is that the usage is right there. There's a synergy between solar production and local consumption, in fact. That's becoming an ever more important issue. We talk about self-consumption, collective consumption, storage, where you can smooth production in terms of usage. And what we see, what we're looking at, together with our partners, is that over and beyond transporting energy along long lines, DC, we're trying to think about hubs to connect to production and usage. Let me give you the example of the Rhone. Every 20 or 30 kilometers, you have hydroelectric stations with stations. It's AC, and the production is huge. If we can link 2 units with solar PVs along the dikes, then everything will work on a DC. For example, LED lighting, computers, data centers, recharging electric vehicles, even everything uses DC now. So the idea of plugging in to production and usages throughout the length of these lines. We talked about service stations where people recharge their electric vehicles. You have this local use, this link between production and consumption. If we can achieve all this, we don't want to replace AC by DC everywhere. We could have these little hubs at a given scale, spanning several kilometers. It's really worthwhile. We could thus pool all the usages, and we won't spend all time turning AC into DC for all the usages that I just mentioned. Here we can save a lot in terms of material, energy. You always lose energy if you go from AC to DC. So there are constraints, granted, but there are lots of opportunities too. And you have to incorporate these opportunities in the system to be efficient overall. If you just look at Ophelia or something a bit bigger against the current landscape, it will never really work. You have to try to make the most of all the possible synergies, in particular with all these usage cases. There's one I forgot, which is the production of hydrogen. That uses DC. There's a lot of demand for greening river navigation, thanks to the recharging of electric boats. You can do this in the locks. If the lock is next to a plant, then you can concentrate solar production there. That opens up a whole host of very worthwhile opportunities, technologically speaking, and from an economic stance, because the cost is really the key parameter. Thank you. That's a very important issue, too. In the mix, you have to be competitive. If you take the example of Wattway, are these solutions sufficiently competitive? Now, I imagine they're a bit more costly than other solutions on the market. Yes. Indeed, we're ramping up our skills in this area. We've worked a lot on all these matters, and in particular, lowering costs. When you create a technology, that technology is not right away at the market price. We started at 20 euros, the peak watt, for our first prototype. Then I think we divided by 3 the price, and we ended up with 6 euros in 2021. We divided the price again by 3. Now we stand at around, for projects between 100 and 500 kilos, the cost is between 250 and 230 euros, and will probably be under 2 euros in 2 years' time. And basically, what we propose to our customers, often import managers and this, that, and the other, for all these players who can't install traditional photovoltaic panels, we give them an alternative to the network price. And they're trying to know when they'll get their return on investment given the network price. So this is what we offer them. That's what they're interested into. They want to see whether it's profitable to roll out this kind of energy plan. Likewise, they need visibility when it comes to the price of the energy they use. I'm thinking in particular of the protection they're seeking against any major increase in the price of energy. Look what happened with the crisis in Ukraine. We have an output of, or a return of about 20% currently. Our panels are less productive, as you said, than traditional solar panels. There are 2 main reasons. First, because they're lying flat. They can't be oriented. And second reason is that we have added a thickness on the surface. We've added a resin, which is anti-skid, and this resin slightly halts the passage of the photons. So we are still profitable. There's a good return on investment. And furthermore, we're not necessarily limited by the amount of land available when we use surfaces which have already been paved over. Thank you.
Thank you. We've gone over by 4 minutes. We had many more questions to ask you. It was fascinating. I have questions that were coming through, but I don't have the time to take them. So thank you all. I think we can give them a round of applause. Arnaud de Sainte-Marie, Karine Plaza, Sophie Guillaume-Otonia, and Frédéric Stork Warm thank you to all of you, and thank you for attending all these conferences and roundtables, and have a great end of the day.